Hi, and welcome back to the Nook. Wow, what an amazing start to the video. Thank you so much for spending your time here with me once again. I know I haven't been on this channel for a while, and some of you have noticed that. So yeah, the past month and a half, I haven't been making videos simply because I haven't been reading as much. It was really difficult to read anything, and that is like the number one worst thing to happen if you're making an entire channel based on reading and books. Anyway, today I thought that I had amassed enough books to share with you all, and actually half of the books I have not read. It's kind of like my reading wrap up plus some new books that I've gotten that I wanted to share with everyone. And I wanted to make this video precisely because there's this really interesting festival going on right now in Singapore called the Singapore Writers Festival. I'm not sponsored to say anything about this festival, by the way. It's just really an annual affair where all sorts of writers and all sorts of people interested in writing and beyond writing, even just like media and content and just producing and creating works, gather for a month of panels, workshops, activities, and it's really fun. The first weekend is already over, and I'm trying to get this video uploaded before the second weekend rolls around. So if you're in Singapore and you're in the area, do check it out. I do think it's quite worth checking out some of the really interesting panels. And I know some of you, some of the authors that they've invited to come down are really cool and interesting. I think for me, I don't really read a lot of fiction, and I think a big part of the slump that I experienced in the past month was really because I tried to read a lot of novels and a lot of fiction, but the thing that broke me out of my reading slump was really non-fiction and, really scientific, heavy, sort of very dry non-fiction. So I realized I shouldn't really push myself in reading things that I normally can't find myself interested in, which is fine, as long as I do read some fiction here and there. It's not like I'm only sticking to one genre, right? So that was my status update, and let's start with the very first book, which I am super interested to share with everyone. The first book I want to share is The Breaks, an essay by Julietta Singh. So if you know, this is the book that I curated for Wormhole's Surprise Your Shelf edition. I kind of want to explain how I got to this book. So I was just researching about decolonial, academia sort of things. Like I was just trying to find like an academic that could write about decolonial ways of thinking in a way that I could understand. The author herself is based in Canada, so she's definitely not from this region. She has kind of like a heritage from South Asia as well as like I think Eastern Europe, if I'm not wrong, and that kind of blends into this space where she finds herself trying to teach her child how to live in this world. And I think it's a very common theme in which a lot of like women of color or women of whatever minority identity or marginal identity, how they teach their children to survive in the world is very different from majority people from majority groups or people from groups that are much more privileged. Like the way that you teach your child, this is something that comes up a lot in this kind of experience, and I do think that comes out a lot here. The Breaks, which is the title of the book, is precisely what she's trying to focus on, and like how do you live on through the breaks. Like you shouldn't just be surviving through like these difficult moments just for like the good and beautiful and great moments, but rather like life is full of the breaks, like moments in which you have to hold on in a way that is still beautiful and still thriving and still how do I say, like worth it and like loving in its own way. So you're not just like ignoring all these like lapses in your ability or lapses in like in all sorts of ways, like when things fall apart, when systems like collapse, And Julietta Singh also talked about her disability at some points. Like, she did go through an accident that rendered her a kind of chronic pain, and thinking about how her body in itself also had to go through these moments of pain, and that she can't just ignore the pain. She had to live through the pain, and through that pain she had to be able to find a life that was still beautiful and still loving and still aligned to her political beliefs. And I think that's just like how the book is kind of thin, and it's just like a bunch of her own personal reflections, but how she tied a lot of her own thoughts on, queer parenting, on living in a world that has this historical legacy of colonialism and of violence and of discriminating against people that look like you, and how she had to handle all of that in wanting to build this really loving and beautiful world for her daughter. I think that was really striking to me. And I don't know whether you followed some of my earlier videos, this theme of parenthood has been a major theme in a lot of the books I've been reading on the climate, and especially in the face of collapse. So this is one example, and Warmth is also another example that I really enjoyed. And also Gen Dread, I think, touched a lot on this idea of like, how do you care for your children in a rapidly collapsing world, and why people still choose to have children and what that means. I really enjoyed this book, which is why I picked it for the Surprise Your Shelf. So it is available on the Wormhole bookstore page. If not, you can definitely get it from the website itself. And I am so happy to be able to share this with all of you, because I've had this book since April. But now I can really freely share it because the surprise has been revealed. So I really enjoyed it, and I am looking forward to reading Julietta Singh's other books, I guess a bit more of her academic books. So that is the first book I want to share with you all. Okay, now we're going to the books that I actually read. I kind of feel like I read more books, but these are the books that I remember. Okay, the first book I want to share here is Brown is Redacted, Reflecting on Race in Singapore, edited by Kristian-Marc James Paul, Mysara, Alijaru, and Myle. So this book is published by Ethos. And if you're familiar with Ethos, and I guess you don't have to be familiar with Ethos, but I've talked about Ethos books a lot on my channel. They do a fantastic job on non-fiction titles, specifically like collections of essays, anthologies of things. And this is really one good example of an anthology that is really quite well balanced, in my opinion, of like how it balances a lot of different perspectives. And what I really enjoyed about this book is that it is based off, I mean, it's not really based off, but it was kind of catalyzed by this play called Brown is Haram that was put up by Kristian and Mysara. It was a performance lecture that had quite an intimate audience, I think, because it was kind of at the peak of COVID. And so there wasn't a lot of audience for it. So I was really glad that they kind of continued it in a way, because I think when you have these kinds of topics and you have these kinds of like performances, you want to be able to like continue the conversation. Like how the book starts is that there is a note by the director, and then there's also the script here, the play itself, and then afterwards you have a sort of review or like reflections by an audience member who also happens to be a very prominent like I guess critic or arts person, I don't know how to describe it, like arts worker, critic, literary critic in Singapore, Nabila Said. And I really love how there's this full circle moment with the play from the beginning to the end, like from the genesis of it to the product of it, of like, you know, the experience of watching it. And then afterwards it goes to these different excerpts. You know, there are sort of academic essays, but there's also poems, and there's also just prose. I really like how they organize the essays in terms of theme, rather than like anything specific to each of the contributors' backgrounds. So they have being, choice, and without, and talking about how the concept of brown in Singapore as a minority group has such a huge range of experiences, and that, you know, brown is something that is a label that is continuously being contested by people who identify as brown or people who have been kind of labeled as brown by other people. I still think there is a lot of defensiveness from the Chinese majority population in Singapore when it comes to talking about race in Singapore, because it's been such an entrenched idea that you can't talk about specific things, you know, that are like OB markers, which is out of bounds markers, if you know what I'm talking about. Things that include race, religion, nationality, things like that. And the funny thing is that I always believe that in Southeast Asia, things are so much more varied and mixed than we think. Like, our histories are so messy and our histories are so entangled that it doesn't really make sense to have a Chinese exceptionalism in Singapore, because that is very artificially constructed, and it's been very, very intentionally created by people who are very privileged here. So it is a thing that I feel shouldn't really exist in Singapore. And you know, Singapore is indeed a country that has such variety of cultures and of backgrounds and of stories and all sorts of things, and everyone is just so different. Yeah, like, we don't really have that space to question the labels that have been put upon us. Yeah, and I think this is a really great book that allows those voices to shine through, in terms of like people who identify as brown and want to accept that label, want to celebrate that label, but also people who contest what that means in the Singaporean context. And I think that's such a great anthology to have on that conversation. Okay, great. Let's move on to the next book. And that is The Brilliant Abyss, True Tales of Exploring the Deep Sea, Discovering Hidden Life and Selling the Seabed by Helen Skills. This has been on my TBR pile for a while, and I'm really glad that I picked it up, because this was the book that broke me out of my reading slump, and that's when I realized that, wow, I really do enjoy books like this. The reason why I wanted to read this is because I didn't really read a lot of books on the ocean. There was another one that I wanted to read on rising sea levels. I think it's called The Water Will Come. But I do think that is a bit more of a like city or human-centric perspective, whereas this was kind of like a quick overview of deep sea science in the past few decades. The one chapter that is the most I guess striking would be the last chapter on mining the seabed, which is also a very, very big topic right now, and I see a lot of people talking about it online, which is a good thing. And it's this very pertinent idea of mining the deep sea for precious metals that can be used in batteries. And you know, with the whole transition to so-called clean energy, batteries are in huge demand because of how difficult it is to access the sea floor. Like, it is for most of human history, completely unknown. So the fact that in a few decades, like, people would kind of progress from like, oh, we don't really know what's inside it, to now wanting to go down to the seafloor to take these nodules of metals, is kind of wild. I think that's kind of an overreach in some senses. I really, really appreciate how there are pictures also in the middle, and you can see here, these are the different sort of like jellyfish-like creatures that they found in the deep sea, and that's really, really cool. I can't imagine why people can get so obsessed with the deep sea, because it's just so weird. Like, it's just so alien. Next book that I read is not really a book, it's kind of like a picture book, and I think a lot of you might know this cartoonist. This is Shinsuke Yoshitake, and it's called Why Do I Feel Like This? You know what? I think I kind of bought this on impulse because I just felt like I was in such a mess with my emotions, and reading this actually helped me a lot with my emotions, which, you know, just proves that, you know, books like these are not just for children. Yeah, and I just think that the expressions are just so cute. Everything in this book is just so lovely to read and so soothing in a way. I think I've never felt so soothed by a book before, and I guess that's the charm of children's books. Yeah, or I mean, and that's probably what I need. I'm just a child right now. Yeah, I don't know why I pretend to be an adult. Moving on to the last book that I read, called Bitch by Lucy Cooke. is it Cooke? A Revolutionary Guide to Sex Evolution in the Female Animal. Now, this was not on my TBR. This was a book that I found on a visit to the library. I visited the library because I really wanted to get out of my reading slump. So that's when I found The Brilliant Abyss as well as this book. And you know what? This book is freaking fantastic. I am just so in love with this book. There was another book that I was reading that had a pretty similar concept, I think called something about Darwin's beauty thing. Like, it was a book on the evolution of beauty. There are a lot of processes and a lot of a lot of species that don't really make sense because they're not so functional in a lot of ways. And I think in a lot of species, like the sexual reproduction and sexual selection process, is also a lot of a mystery around it because, you know, it doesn't seem to make sense in a human way. And so this author, Lucy Cooke, she follows a lot of different scientists in their pursuit of kind of demystifying the female in different species. And even the concept of female and male is not very clear in a lot of species. And also there's just a huge variety of things. There's so many interesting case studies in this book. And I absolutely loved like devouring this book. I didn't think it would be that fun. I do think that there are some parts that are pretty dry because she just goes on about all these different case studies. Like almost every 5 pages is like a new animal that she's trying to explain to you. I enjoy that a lot because I really love reading about these sorts of things. Like from young, I've always been such a huge like wildlife nerd in a sense. Like I subscribe to National Geographic, and I also subscribed to the Discovery Channel, and I was like, my biggest idol was Steve Irwin. So I have always been very interested in like animal behavior, just like non-human stuff, and this really scratched that itch for me. Like I was very enraptured by a lot of the different creatures that the author talked about here. There are all these evolutionary theories that were only proposed much later on because, you know, a lot of evolutionary theory was first brought to prominence and first brought to like common popular belief during Darwin's time, which is, you know, the Victorian era, where people still very much believed that women are of lower cognitive capacity, or like, you know, women were the same level as like children really. And so there were a lot of inherent biases that scientists had during that time towards the study of other animals, in which, you know, they were already filtering out certain things that they wanted to see. And this is true of all science, I believe. Even though I've read, you know, a lot of science books, I don't ever see science as like an end all. I don't see science as like true, how do I say, like solid fact or like concrete fact. Science is just an accumulation of what we know, humans know about the world through a human lens and human tools, right? And so that doesn't mean like that is concrete, because we all know that our perceptions always change and our tools always change with time. So things that we understand now and in the future would be very different. Like it will always be changing, and science is just what we can capture at that time. So reading this kind of book really helps kind of illuminate that fact that, like, you know, science is always evolving and science is always influenced by the biases of the people doing the studies that time. And now when we think about science, we have to think about like, where is, you know, the center of knowledge coming from, and who is producing the knowledge, and where are the gaps of knowledge that we have to like buffer the whole field with. And that's the same for like every sector of like thought, you know, maybe like even physics or even like geography, you know, who is producing the knowledge. A lot of the scientists that made these discoveries in terms of like female behavior, a lot of their works were pushed back, a lot of them were rejected, and it's only now that certain theories about, you know, say female pairings in terms of parenting, or even just like female aggression, those things were so rejected back in the day. Yeah, this is precisely what I love reading, which is just like sciencey, nerdy stuff about sex and like gender, sexuality, about sexuality, gender, etc. Like, it's really nerdy. I don't think it's everyone's cup of tea, but it's definitely my cup of tea, and I drank it for like 3 days straight. just read it completely in 3 days. Okay, now let's talk about some of the books that I have. New books that I've added to my bookshelf, which I haven't read yet. The first book I want to talk about is What We Inherit Growing Up Indian. And this, I would say, is a bit similar to Brown as Redacted, but this is kind of like a follow-up to Growing Up Perempuan, which is a book that I talked about before. It was published by Aware, but I would kind of expect that it would be similar in terms of like personal essays, because I think when I read Growing Up Perempuan, it was very much like very heartfelt essays and very vulnerable essays, and a lot of them were contributors like from a lot of different places. So they're not just people who in the field. There's a lot of people who are just like everyday people who submitted their stuff for these things. So it's really, really cool. The cover is really, really powerful, because in Singapore, a lot of people do make racist comments on people with darker skin, kind of like calling them names or like trying, implying they should like clean themselves because they're dirty and whatsoever. So I think this cover is really, really such a powerful image that captures that kind of common experience that a lot of people have felt, like have gone through growing up in Singapore, having darker skin, or being Indian in Singapore, which is really, really upsetting. When I saw the cover, I was really heartbroken, and I just think it's really, really terrible that people have to go through that at such a young age, and that the children who make these comments are probably emboldened by their parents in some ways to make similar comments. Because I have heard comments like that from older people around me, which is really, really upsetting. Yeah. Okay, so that is the first book I wanted to talk about. Next book I want to talk about is Of the Florids by Shawn Hoo. Disclaimer, Shawn Hoo is my friend, so you don't have to take my thoughts as like objective. But anyway, everything on this channel is subjective because they're just my thoughts. So yes, I do know the author of this poetry collection. I have read half of it so far, and I think I got distracted and stopped. And I really, really like it in a way that it talks a lot about the natural history in Singapore, and also about the process of naming things. I think that's a very, very cool intersection to be thinking about, especially in Singapore, where we do have this conflict of language in some ways. English is our national language, but it's not really a language that's native to here, especially if you think about the region. Having a country where the national language is English is kind of weird. Shawn will be on a panel in the Singapore's Writers' Fest. Oh, and so will be... So the authors of these books will be at the Singapore Writers' Fest. So you should definitely check them out. They will have a book launch during the festival. And they also will be on a panel talking about care, which is really, really cool. So do check them out if you can. I think Shawn will be on a panel about future voices of Singh Lit, so that's really, really exciting. Yeah. This is a book from Wormhole as well. This is the previous Surprise Your Shelf, I think. And it's just apparently it's just one sentence. 50,000 word sentence. And it reminds me of when I used to write essays in school, my teacher would say that I write too many run-on sentences, which is very true. So I kind of feel like that looking at this book. I have no idea what it is gonna be about. This is really nice to touch. It's like irrelevant parts of the review, but it is quite nice to touch. Okay, this book, Nusantara, A Sea of Tales by Heidi Shamsuddin. Yeah, really, really cool. Quite literally, I was at the bookstore of the Singapore Writers' Fest, and I was like, you know what, I really, really want to find a collection of mythologies from Southeast Asia. I've always wanted to find a good collection of mythologies from Southeast Asia, and then I found this, which is exactly what I wanted, which is a collection of folktales, fairy tales, myths, and legends from the Nusantara and Southeast Asian region, and written to sit alongside other great anthologies of folklore from other parts of the world. I do think it's pretty straightforward. It's like there's the tales and then kind of like where it's from. So this one's like from Vietnam, and then There's this one from Malaysia. I don't know why I have begun to be so interested in mythologies. Maybe it's because I read Dead Mothers as well, or maybe because I read the book on the wolves, The Women Who Run with the Wolves. I didn't think it was a good book, but I really enjoyed the idea of studying the archetype in mythologies, and I think those really do show us a lot about what we think about different archetypes. Like, what is the wise woman archetype? Who is like the monster archetype, and what did he represent? I think those are really cool, so I'm quite interested to see what I will have here. Last book I want to talk about is Anything But Human by Daryl Lim Weijie. Okay, let me just see whether there is a general synopsis that I can use to describe this, because I find it very difficult to describe creative things. Like, if you ask me to talk about what I read in a non-fiction book, I find it so easy to just tell you as evidence from my ramblings early on. Okay, but anyway, this collection emerges squeaking and poorly oiled from this rubbish heap we've all piled up. It revels in the transfixing beauty of this last stage of man. These poems have dwelt too close to the nuclear waste facility. These poems have traversed through fields of madness for grains of truth. These poems attempt to wring the last dregs out of language. Anything But Human grasps for poetry beyond our collective exhaustion. I don't really know what that means, but I am quite willing to figure out what that means. I do think it's kind of like the theme of a wasted urban landscape, a wasteland of an urban landscape, and talking about the kind of how far can you push this urban idea, like the opposite of a beautiful utopian, like technological paradise, which I wouldn't really say it's dystopian. It's just more of like, how would you push that aesthetic, I guess. This reminded me, I did actually finish another book called LONTAR, but LONTAR is like a journal, it's not really like a book. So I did finish the final issue of LONTAR. I really enjoyed that book, and it's had so many interesting stories. Also some of the mythologies that were reimagined in a kind of speculative, almost even like futuristic way. Really enjoyed that. Yes, I just remembered that I read that book as well. Highly recommended. And I do think this kind of falls in the same sort of theme of human technology, the opposite of going back to the land. Like it's kind of going back to the land, but it's human wasteland, so it's like technological waste, and just remains of human invention, I feel. Okay, yeah, I can't believe I forgot that I read LONTAR, but I don't have the book with me now. I lent it out. I guess nowadays I'm only really reading like speculative fiction, or like even sci-fi. I wouldn't say I read sci-fi because I'm not really so deep into that genre yet, but I definitely do enjoy a lot of mythology, kind of like historical speculative work, and just like generally like sciencey nerdy stuff. It doesn't have to be sci-fi. Those are all the books I want to talk about in this video. Well, it is a very long video again, and thank you so much for watching. Thank you so much for sticking with me, even though I've been like on and off on my channel. Maybe I'll do a vlog of the Singapore's Writers Fest for this month. If I do see you, then I'll see you. If I don't, then it's okay. I mean, just enjoy the festival as much as you can, if you are still going for it. But as always, thank you so much for watching my videos and enjoying the books and enjoying whatever I say about the books. So see you around. Take care. Yes, and have a nice day. If not, have a nice night. Take care of yourself. Rest well. Drink lots of water. That's very important. And yeah, I'll see you in the next video. Bye!